Hello, hello, hello. This is the Vanilla.js podcast. I'm Chris Ferdinandi. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm talking about when you should use a framework and when you should use Vanilla.js instead. I advocate for embracing the web platform whenever you can, but Vanilla.js doesn't mean handwriting every single line of code. Sometimes using a helper function or two is enough, other times a plugin, and sometimes a full-fledged library or framework is the right call. And we talked about this a little bit in our last episode on the most common myth of Vanilla.js. I'll drop a link to that down in the show notes. One question I get asked quite a bit is, when should you use a framework? How do you know when it makes sense and when Vanilla.js is enough? There's some nuance here. If you're building an app above a certain level of complexity, I personally think state-based UI makes things easier to manage and less prone to errors. And if you're not entirely sure what state-based UI is, I will add a link into the show notes where you can learn a little bit more about that. But on the surface, it means that you have a data object, your state, quote unquote, which is a bunch of information about the app. Let's say it was a to-do list app. It would be to-do items and whether they've been marked as complete or not. And then you tell the state-based UI library, if the data looks like this, the UI should look like this. If it looks like that, the UI should look like that instead. And then you never bother touching the UI directly. You update your data and let the framework or library do its thing. If you're using state-based UI that updates reactively to user interactions, you probably want to use DOM diffing instead of just re-rendering the whole UI with inner HTML. DOM diffing is a process where the library or framework looks at how the UI currently is and what it should look like, and then figures out what needs to change. Instead of repainting everything, it just adds or removes a class, toggles some text, things like that. Basically all the stuff you would do with manual DOM manipulation, it figures out for you. If you're going to use DOM diffing, then I think it's a good idea to reach for a framework or library because it's really complicated and hard to do well. If you're going to use a library or framework, and for those of you who have read If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, this starts to feel a little bit like that. I personally recommend using a smaller one that forgoes a virtual DOM. Options like Preact, Alpine.js, or my own Reef.js fall into that bucket. They're a fraction of the size of React and Vue and actually more performant for moderately sized apps. I'll drop some links in the show notes on those smaller options as well as the performance metrics behind that. If you're building apps with tons of data and DOM nodes like Facebook, Twitter, QuickBooks, a full-sized framework like React or Vue may be a better choice because of how the virtual DOM works. But generally speaking, we're not building apps of that size. And for the average person, if you need state-based UI, I actually think something like Preact or Reef is probably a better choice. So hopefully that clears some things up. That's it for today's episode. If you want to finally master Vanilla.js, head over to vanillajsguides.com to check out my pocket guides and video courses. As a listener of the show, you can take 30% off with the code podcast at checkout. See you next time. Cheers.